Hi, welcome back to Cubs and Culture for January 17th, 2018. Continuing our review of Life of Pi, I want to talk exclusively about the second act in this movie at this point, and I'm going to define the second act. So if you haven't seen the movie is basically a story in which an author is being told a retrospective story by a man named Pi when he's older, about basically it's his story about how he comes to it's a coming of age story basically, being told in retrospect. Where sort of the main section of the movie is about, and this is the second act, and how the main character, when he's traveling to Canada, ends up shipwrecked on a lifeboat, and it's hard to say anything more specific than that because of the fucking third act. But basically, and for the second act, it's the moment from when the ship's up, from the moment in which he goes out because the storm's happening on the ship, to the point where he's discovered on the beach in Mexico. Okay, so that's the act I want to talk about. So if you're ignoring what happens in the third act, what happens in the second act is Pi's family owns a zoo, and the animals get out. So he ends up on a lifeboat with a tiger, hyena, zebra, and orangutan. And in pretty short order, the hyena kills the zebra and orangutan, and then the tiger, Richard Parker's the tiger's name, kills the hyena. Okay, so most of the second act, most of the second act is basically this teenage kid trying to survive at sea while sharing a lifeboat with a Bengal tiger. The thing, and so on that level, it's like this is absurd, right? And one of the best shots in this movie is Patel is literally caught between, on one hand, sharks circling in the ocean below him, and a tiger on the boat staring at him. And so it's really, so the second act's concerned with feeding the tiger, taming the tiger, getting water, surviving, etc. And it's if you just lift the second act out of this film and ignore what happens in the first act and third act, it's some of the most compelling sort of existentialist dread of the absurd of life happening, because he's dealing with a fucking tiger while also dealing with trying to survive at sea. So it's both horrifying and amusing and comedic. And also because of the direction, or not just direction, the story, the movie is very often contrasts sort of like the beauty of a situation and then the immediate harshness of the situation. So you can see this, where everything sort of has this tragic comedy feel to it. So at one point, for example, there's a very pretty scene where at night there's a bunch of bioluminescent jellyfish, and he's on Pi's on a raft, etc. And he's playing around the water. It's very, very pretty. And then all of a sudden you see this, I think it's supposed to be a blue whale. It's a big whale. Come along, and it jumps out of the water. And it's one of this gorgeous, gorgeous shot. But then it crashes in the water and knocks over all of his stuff, and he loses a bunch of fresh water and food and everything like that. So there's constantly this crash of contrasting of beauty with sort of the beauty of nature with the red tooth and claw of nature. Another sort of example of this is the flying fish sequence where he gets in. Pi gets injured, but he also gets food because there's a flying fish storm. Okay, so The second act directorially is mythical, and then Lee does a lot of things like somewhat like he did with and the Hulk, where there's panel editing with about it. So it ends up being very mythical. It's very visually, like, it's absolutely a gorgeous looking film, and the way in which Pi's faith is portrayed, and because he's sort of praying, he's just saying God, or sometimes he says Kishnu, which is sort of the main deity in Hinduism. That it's basically become, like, again, it really would be really easy to interpret it as sort of a existentialist trying to confront the absurdity of the situation. Okay, so the second act by itself is extremely compelling, and in some ways very funny. Okay, so there's, setting that aside, there is one element in everything in the second act that happens. Some of it's good fortune, but there's nothing really in it that breaks the rules of reality, except for one thing. He ends up. So to set this up, there's a storm, and he's really, really desperate, and so he ends up praying. Basically, it's sort of very touching that, like, okay, existence, the divine, you've won, take me now, and he ends up saying, I'm ready, take me now, take me now. He ends up on this island, which is a carnivorous island with meerkats. And there's no real soil. It's just a carnivorous plant, a bit like a pitcher plant, has grown up in the ocean. Now, here's the thing. No such thing actually exists. But it's not utterly biologically impossible. So, in the course of the second act, before you get to the fucking third act that ruins everything, it doesn't come across as bullshit, or absolute, like the film's like or Pi is lying to you, like he could be, like, over the course of the story, because it's being told in retrospective. Eventually, maybe the thought of him being an unreliable narrator would occur, but as it's actually playing out, it doesn't come across as that. It comes across as magical realism, where magical realism is a genre of story. Slumdog Millionaire is another example of this, where it's a very realistic setting and everything is extremely plausible, but there's one element that you can't explain. And so the island comes across, because again, it didn't actually occur in biology, but there's nothing, at least to my knowledge, that makes it conceptually impossible for there to be like a giant pitcher plant in the ocean. So the thing is, remember I said this is after he sort of breaks down and is praying to shouting to the powers that be, I'm ready, take me now. That comes across as an answer to his prayer, and you got to realize his entire story has been set up as a story that will prove God exists to you. So this miraculous island works as sort of an answer to, his prayer, and because he gets this island, which is sort of a magical realist thing, God, the existence of the divine could be proved. So, like, the theme is some way complete with this island, except that wasn't what the author was thinking of. So I also want to quickly say, like, technically the second act is very good. It's like the CGI for Richard Parker and all the the movie is the second act is like not like more almost as much CGI as Avatar. Like 90% CGI, but it doesn't feel CGI. It's very, very good, and Ang Lee made some choices to make it have something of a not just a mythical quality, but an illustrative quality. So it feels a bit more like, with the cinematography and the CGI, a bit more like watercolor. Again, if we're talking about the second act, it's a really good thing, and you don't have to do the sort of the final beat in the story to complete sort of the central theme of the believing in belief. That the final thing that happens just fucks this everything up. It actually ends up making the fucking sort of magical realist emotion or joy you feel not being like it's the joy you feel in those moments when you're watching the second act isn't sincere, because it's actually ultimately structured that you're feeling this joy. You're supposed to then end up going through this ontological argument for God's existence. Fuck, I hate the third act of this movie. I'm going to pause there because I need to talk. Before I can continue talking, I need to set up the first act and third act. Okay, so let me pause there. Okay, see you in a bit.